Hello, welcome to this video. This is Weimar and Nazi Germany revision, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through some essay plans, and so it will help you to think about what kind of things you could say. I've based this on the specification, and I kind of think it's covered most of the key things that you would need to think about. All right, so one of the first questions they could ask you is they could get you to think about why Germany faced problems after the First World War. For that, you could talk about the economic problems linked to the war, 150 billion marks in debt. You could also talk about military problems and mutinies. For example, the German military at this time were not following orders. They were mutinying, for example, and in the Kiel Canal, there were protests all over Germany as well. Basically, the people of Germany it's a pretty desperate and chaotic time. Also, you could talk about the fact that there's a new and inexperienced government. The Kaiser had been ruling for a long, long time, and he abdicates on the 9th of November. And so the new government that takes over is at first, it's going to be temporary before they have elections in January 1919. Its first thing it has to do is sign the armistice on 11th of November, and it's really inexperienced. Okay, so the next thing they could ask you to look at the Weimar Constitution, which is finalized in August 1919, and they could ask you, give you some interpretations, one saying it's positive, one saying it's negative. So kind of things that some own knowledge you could bring in. It's democratic. Men and women over the age of 20 could vote, so it's positive. Proportional representation meant that smaller voices had, smaller political parties were given a voice. In other voting systems, they just ignore the smaller parties. Power was shared between the president, chancellor, Reichstag MPs, and the local Länder governments. So before, remember, the Kaiser had a lot of control. Now they're going to share it out a bit more evenly. In terms of the weaknesses, because they're allowing smaller parties to have more kind of influence in the Reichstag, there's a lot more arguments between the political parties, which will mean that it's more difficult to make decisions. Article 48 was a problem. In an emergency, which wasn't clearly defined, the president would have way too much power. And basically, in an emergency, the president can actually act like a dictator, and it won't be very democratic at all. So 1919 to 1923, they could ask you to explain why the Weimar Republic was challenged. You could talk about challenges from the left and right, and this is going to be looking at the Spartacist uprising of January 1919, which is communist, the Kapp Putsch in March 1920. You could also, and please note, I haven't put the Munich Putsch there, Hitler's putsch, because that really wasn't much of a challenge. Hyperinflation, you could talk about the Ruhr crisis, the French invasion, striking workers, how Germany had to print more money to pay the striking workers, and then the currency spirals out of control, and it costs 200 billion marks for a loaf of bread. So that's hyperinflation in 1923. And the third challenge you could explain would be the fact that the government is unpopular for signing the armistice in 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. You could talk about some of the things in the Treaty of Versailles, for example, the 6.6 billion reparations, and that the government, the new democratic government, were called the November criminals, linking to the armistice in November 1918, and also there was this belief that the German army had been betrayed, the stab in the back myth. So in interpretation, you could be asked what the biggest challenge to Weimar was. I can imagine one historian saying it was the uprisings, and another one saying, oh, it was hyperinflation, and I think that has come up before in a previous paper. I would say that hyperinflation was the biggest challenge as it affected pretty much all people in Germany, whereas the plots before were actually just in Berlin, and they never really were that successful, whereas hyperinflation does inflict some really serious damage on Germany's economy. Okay, and then they could ask you about the extent to which the Weimar Republic was stable in this period. They could get one historian saying, actually, it wasn't that bad, and another historian saying, no, it really was quite bad. I would argue that actually it was very unstable, although there are some things that were okay. The new constitution was democratic, and you could talk about the fact that the uprising, the Spartacist uprising and Kapp Putsch failed. But generally speaking, as you can see on the right-hand side, there were loads of problems. So I would argue that it was unstable. Okay, the next thing, why the Weimar economy improved 1924 to 1929. So this is where we're starting to look at this period, sometimes known as the golden years for Weimar, when things actually get better. And remember, you're going to be thinking about Stressman for this. So you could say the economy improves after hyperinflation because there's a new currency, the mark is replaced by the Rentenmark, and obviously this is Stressman who's doing that. You could also say the economy improves because they're borrowing money from US banks, $25 billion with the Dawes Plan in 1924. This is going to be used to be invested into the German economy, and so German businesses can expand. they can build more factories, etc. And that's also going to employ more people. The other thing is they're paying less in reparations. So the Dawes plan reduces the yearly reparation payments, and the Young plan actually reduces the total that they have to pay down from 6.6 to £2 billion. The other thing you could say is Germany's relationship has improved with its with many European countries. So trade will also help the economy to improve as well. So next thing, explain why Germany's reputation abroad improved. You could talk about Locarno Pact, when Germany agrees to the borders from the Treaty of Versailles, and it improves its reputation and relationship with countries like Britain and France. League of Nations is when Germany is accepted into this in 1926, and this shows that Germany is more trusted and Germany's reputation is improving. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. This is an agreement between a number of countries, and they're basically saying that they're not going to use war to, solve their problems. They're just going to try and do it peacefully. And it shows that Germany was starting to be seen as more of a peaceful country. All of this is done when Stresemann is the Foreign Secretary for Germany. Okay. 1924 to 1929, we could look at the changes to society. Well, first change you could explain would be that living standards have improved. Wages up by 25%, 100,000 new homes. Unemployment's gone down from 2 million to 1.3 million. The working week has got shorter, from 50 hours to 46 hours, and they've introduced unemployment insurance as well, which is going to help workers for when they get sick or can't work. There also, you could explain the changes for women. New women smoking more, more makeup, more revealing outfits. You could talk about the fact there's 112 female MPs, and just how women becoming more independent as well and given more freedom. Also, you could talk about the cultural changes, of which there are many. Architecture, Bauhaus, art, Otto Dix, film, Metropolis. This was seen to be more of a modernistic, futuristic time for German art and culture. Okay, a typical question could be interpretation. They ask you about 1924 to 1929, and they're asking you to think, sorry, just wait for the bell. Did Weimar actually recover in this period, or did it not? I would argue that Weimar has recovered, and it does do quite well. However, one of the big issues is they've borrowed too much money from the USA, but I would say on balance, this was a positive time. The next thing, explain why there are changes to the Nazi Party. And that should be, by the way, 1920 to 1922. So this is the first bit of the Nazi Party. You could talk about the 25-point program, where Hitler sets out the Nazi ideas very, very clearly in this document. You could talk about the name change and propaganda. They changed the name of the party from the German Workers' Party, the DAP, to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. What they're doing there is they're appealing to more working class people who like the fact that it's a socialist party, even though it really wasn't a properly a socialist party. And then the SA as well was introduced, which helped the Nazi Party to protect themselves when they're meeting up and having these political meetings, but also to intimidate other political parties. Okay, the next thing, why did they attempt the putsch in November 1923? Well, you could say that Hitler didn't like the Weimar government. He wanted to overthrow it because he hated democracy and the fact that the government had signed the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles, which he saw as betrayals of Germany and the German military. The other thing is you could say he was inspired by Mussolini. Mussolini was also a fascist. He had similar ideas to Hitler, and he'd come to power in Italy in 1922, so Hitler's inspired. The third thing you could say is 1923 is the perfect time because it's the year of hyperinflation and it's when Weimar Republic was at its weak point. And so they believe that this is a really good time to attack Weimar whilst it's still weak. You could also say that he's chosen Munich because it was the place where the Nazi Party at this time in 1923 had the most support. So the next thing is we're looking at 23 to 29. Hitler's been sent to prison after the Munich putsch, but then actually in some respects you could say that the Nazi Party was able to strengthen. So they become much more organized in this period. They set up local political branches of the Nazi Party all over Germany. They're organized like a government in waiting. So, for example, they'd have a specific foreign policy department, which made them seem ready to govern. And they also got money from wealthy German businessmen like Krupps, which is going to help them later on because they've got enough money for, say, stuff like propaganda. So also, Hitler, whilst he's in prison, writes Mein Kampf, which is a very successful way, a very good way of him spreading his ideas and his message, and German people are going to find out about this. Final thing, which is positive for the Nazi Party in this period. They have the Bamberg Conference in 1926. This is important because Hitler really establishes himself as the main leader of the party. Before, it was always a bit confused. Some people were saying the party should go in one direction. Others were saying it should go in another direction. This meant it was really clear that Hitler was the leader, which meant that the party, in a way, became more organized and had a clearer direction of policy. So they could ask you to what extent the Nazi Party strengthened. So you could say, actually, they've strengthened because they've reorganized. Hitler's treated leniently after the Munich Putsch. He wasn't actually treated that harshly. They could have put him in prison for longer. They could have banned the Nazi Party for longer. But actually, they've not been that strict on him. The Bamberg Conference helped him as well. But you could say in this period, well, it's not great. He's been sent to prison. And the Nazi Party, this is the key thing. The Nazi Party do not get many votes from the German public. So by 1928, they've only got 12 MPs in the Reichstag. And bear in mind, you need about 300 or so to be anywhere near getting into government. So next thing, what suddenly happens in 1929, 1932? Why does the Nazi Party suddenly grow in popularity? Well, we have the Great Depression and unemployment. It gets to about 6 million at one point. People were angry at the Weimar Republic due to the government's failure to deal with Great Depression and unemployment. People also turned to the Nazi Party as they just liked Hitler, and Nazi propaganda was effective. We know he was a good public speaker, and the Nazis were quite clever with their propaganda. And the third reason is there were a bunch of middle-class and wealthy Germans who don't actually really buy the Hitler's propaganda, but they like the fact that he's saying that he will stand up to communism, and they think that actually if they want to protect their wealth, they've got to vote for the Nazi Party, because if they don't, the communists could get into power. So they could ask you for interpretations on what was the most important reason for the growth of support. So I would say that the Weimar government should be to blame. The Great Depression obviously was very problematic, but the key reason why Germany faced so many problems with this was because that the Weimar government failed to compromise. The different political parties could not agree. And as a result, the problems were made so much worse. People got frustrated and turned to extremist parties like the Nazi Party and the Communist Party. And I would argue, had Weimar been stronger, the chancellors had been able to get people to compromise and work together more, people would not have eventually turned to the Communists and the Nazi Party. So why does he become Chancellor in January 1933? So quite similar to the last question, we could say, first of all, because he's the most popular politician in Germany from July 1932 in that election. So that obviously is linked. You can explain that using the stuff from the previous essay question. You could also talk about the fact that the Weimar government in this period could not solve the problems, and there was many failed chancellors. Brüning, von Papen, and von Schleicher, they all failed to solve the problems in this period. But also, we could say that Hindenburg and von Papen come up with this deal that they're going to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, and they're hoping that von Papen as Vice-Chancellor and Hindenburg as President will be able to control Hitler. So they mistakenly think that they can control Hitler, and that's one of the reasons why he is actually able to become Chancellor. Next thing, explain how Hitler consolidated his power. So this is how he goes from just a bog standard chancellor to a dictator. How, yeah, of course, they say how he consolidates his power. So first thing, the Reichstag fire, he uses this as an excuse to arrest communists. That really gets rid of the communist threat. The Enabling Act, that allows him to pass whatever laws he wants, and he just uses that power to now ban workers going on strike and trade unions, and he bans other political parties. So trade unions, no longer a threat, and also political parties like the Communists, the SDP, Centre Party, they're no longer going to be a threat because he's just used the law to ban them. Final thing, Knights of the Long Knives, that gets rid of the SA threat and Rome, and it keeps the German army happy. Hindenburg just dies naturally. He uses that to consolidate his power by just taking the position of president, combining it with chancellor. He's now going to be called Führer. And the army at the same time swearing an oath of loyalty. And remember, they like him because he's reduced the threat of the SA, and they didn't like the SA. And he asked the German people about this. 90% agree in a referendum to him becoming Führer. So next thing, how is he able to create a police state? So you could say that he's used the police to ensure that nobody criticized the Nazi Party. And that's what the SS, SD, and Gestapo are all about. One of some of the key things they're doing is just finding anyone who's critical of the Nazi Party, and they'll be sent to a concentration camp. They also took control of the legal system by controlling law courts, judges, and removing juries. So that means that all judges are going to have to be approved by the Nazi Party. And if the Nazi Party aren't sure about any of these judges, they're simply going to lose their jobs. And then juries, which are just people from the public who are supposed to be involved in trials and making a decision, they're just going to be taken off. So the key person making the decision is a judge who always will be approved by the Nazi Party. And the other thing he does to create a police state is he really takes control of all aspects of society, even the church. So what he's doing is he's arresting any church member who criticizes the Nazi Party, and he's taking control of the Catholic and Protestant churches, so that they are only really preaching Nazi ideas and messages. So similar to that, how were the Nazi Party able to control and influence attitudes? Well, you could say they used propaganda. They're simply just bombarding Germans with very pro-Nazi ideas. So that's propaganda. Goebbels is key with this. Berlin Olympics would be an example. Art, architecture, film, literature, newspapers, media, radio, etc. Also, they're blocking, censoring anything that was critical of the Nazis or anything that didn't fit in with their views. So, for example, any newspaper that was publishing anything that could be slightly critical of Hitler, blocked, censored. The other thing is you could say that they were very clever with their propaganda and they used the latest technology. For example, radios and film, they adapted radios so they couldn't get special radio stations from abroad. And film, this was quite a new technology, film, but the Nazis used this really effectively. They produced 1,400 films in this period. So why do people oppose the Nazi Party? Well, you can say that people from the church oppose the Nazi Party because of the changes that the Nazi Party were making to Protestantism and Catholicism in Germany, but also because many of the Nazi ideas about treating people harshly, saying that people were not equal, went against some of the key Christian ideas. We've got one of the key figures, Martin Niemöller. He sets up the Confessing Church, which is not going to go along with what Hitler wants. And we get 1,000 religious leaders, Protestant and Catholic, are sent to concentration camps. Also opposition from the young people, swing youth. They were more middle class. They didn't like all of the culture that was being kind of presented to them with Nazi propaganda. They much preferred American style culture, and they set up illegal dances and they liked jazz music. So they're more in opposition to what Hitler was, some of Hitler's cultural changes. And there's also opposition from the Edelweiss pirates. They're more working class. They really didn't like the fact that people were being forced to join these youth groups. They would taunt Hitler Youth members. They were going on long hikes and mocking songs. I think they like this sense of freedom. Okay, so why is there so little resistance to the Nazi Party? Well, you could explain that because the propaganda and censorship was working and that actually people just thought the Nazi Party was doing a good job. You could also say that people were scared. Gestapo, SS, SD, and concentration camps, and the fact that it's a police state. And the other reason you could say is actually people just thought the Nazi Party were doing a good job because of unemployment, stopping the communists getting into power. Okay, so this is a bit of a strange question, but this isn't a past paper question. I made this up, but we'll see something like this could come up. Why has life changed? We could talk about changes for women, more of a focus on family, marriage, and not in employment so much. For example, like no more female judges, teachers, etc., and how their appearance was supposed to be kind of more modest. Youth groups, you could talk about that they're being impacted. So stuff like Catholic youth groups are now closed down. Other youth groups no longer exist. You have to be part of a Nazi one. So Hitler Youth, for example, education schools were impacted with their curriculum and their teachers were being forced to kind of only really teach the Nazi values. League of German Maidens for girls, education curriculum teachers, the same thing. In terms of schools, you can also say they got new curriculum, being taught very anti-Semitic ideas, getting loads more PE, having to do Nazi salutes in lessons. They're having to say Heil Hitler at the beginning and end of the lessons, swastikas in the classrooms, and the curriculum is changing as well. So could we talk about interpretations could be about how successful these Nazi policies were? For example, did it actually work with young people? And I think you'd say, well, look, there's very little evidence of young people not liking the Nazis. We've got the swing youth and Edelweiss pirates. But other than that, we don't really get many examples of this youth resistance. We know that many people joined Hitler Youth and League of German Maidens. And for example, I think 9 million people were members of Hitler Youth. Although just because people have joined up to it doesn't necessarily mean they support the Nazis. We know that the Nazis successfully took over youth groups, but also schools. and this would have had an impact because we know young people tend to be more easy to manipulate. And so, look, I think on balance, we'd have to say it was very successful, although we can't prove that all young people definitely believed in Hitler's values just because, say, for example, they went to school or went to one of Nazi youth group, because they might have just been doing it just because they don't want to be the one not doing it. Okay, how does he get decreased unemployment? Well, first thing, he gets more people working in the labour service. The labour service is very low paid, pretty bad conditions. It's almost like an army camp where Germans would be paid, as I say, very little to do stuff like repair roads, drain marshes, cut down trees. You could actually argue that this wasn't real work because the pay and conditions were so bad. But anyway, he counts it as work, and therefore he's able to say, look, we've got more people in work and unemployment's gone down. The next thing, he does employ a bunch of people working to build autobahns, 7,000 miles planned all over Germany, and this does get more people into work. The other thing is he's got more people in army and military factories due to rearmament. So, for example, more people in the army and more people in the factories producing for the army. So, for example, stuff like producing weapons, producing warplanes. Now, typical interpretation, you could be looking at actually if he was effective or not at reducing unemployment. So you could talk about all of the jobs being added that we've just looked at, unemployment going down. However, you could actually say he wasn't effective because the labour service jobs had really poor conditions and poor pay. And also, you could say he's also tricked the statistics. Hitler included a lot of people as who were unemployed. He just didn't include them in the statistics. So, for example, women and Jews. He also counted people as employed, even if they were only part-time workers and if they're in the labour service. And remember, I've said that the labour service, the pay was so bad and conditions were so bad that I wouldn't count it as a proper job. Overall, you'd say he has partial success. He does bring unemployment down, but he's also tricked the statistics. And so therefore, we can't say it's been a real success. So the next thing is we can get some interpretations on the extent to which living standards have improved. Ooh, I can't see it that clearly, but let's see. So first thing, more people are in employment. Wages have improved for skilled workers in military factories. More people owned cars in this period, so that's a sign that actually life is getting better. And workers are rewarded with things like strength through joy. They're going to have outings. They're going to have theatre trips, even foreign travel. And in some cases, they're being promised this Volkswagen car, which they can pay into for these hard workers. Beauty of labour scheme means that the workplace is going to be better. They're going to have stuff like changing rooms, showers, toilets, canteens, etc. But actually, we can say that things haven't got improved. So the work in the labour service, we know the conditions were really poor. Obviously, this is not good for Jews and women in this period who are no longer allowed to be in work. The length of the working week has actually gone up from 43 to 49 hours. So people might be getting paid a bit more, but they're actually having to work. They're actually having to work more for it. So technically, they're not actually getting paid more per hour. The workers lost rights to negotiate pay as trade unions were banned. Before, workers could go on strike before Hitler comes to power. Now, they're not being allowed to do that. And also the price of goods in Germany has also gone up. So actually people are being paid more, but actually they can't afford to buy as much anything more with that. So it's not really, we would say that's not like a real terms pay increase. And also with the labour front, there's new rules in place that they have to do longer hours. They lost the right to strike, and they could also be punished if they're not working well enough. And the other thing is the promise of the Volkswagen car was never delivered, and no German ever actually received this car. Also, the other thing is with the beauty of labour scheme improving the workplaces, the workers had to make all of the changes themselves. So, for example, they're being told, look, you need to build this new changing room, and they don't get paid any extra for doing it, and they have to do it in their own time. So, look, living standards in Nazi Germany, I would argue, did not improve. They have to do longer hours, worse pay due to rising price of goods, and the harsh conditions. Another question could be just looking at the economy more generally. So you could say that more people are employed and therefore they're paying taxes, which is going to be good for the government. You could say that autobahns were helping trade in Germany because it was easier to drive around, trade, buy and sell things. And you could say that workers, you could argue, were more efficient because they are being treated better with these lovely schemes like Strength Through Joy, and also stuff like the beauty of labour, better workplaces. You could argue that they're going to be working better because they're just happier. Okay, final question is that topic on persecution of minorities. I'll be honest, it's very difficult to kind of work out what type of questions they could ask for this, but I've come up with this. They could ask you what the most significant change to the persecution of Jewish people was. So you could talk about the 1933 boycott. You could talk about the 1935 Nuremberg laws, where Jewish people lost their citizenship and their rights. And also Kristallnacht, which is Jewish people are attacked, synagogues, Jewish homes, Jewish businesses, and 100 Jewish people are killed. I would say that this is the most significant because this is the first time we're seeing mass organized violence against Jewish people. And therefore, I would say that is the most significant example of persecution of Jewish people. Okay, that's the end of this video. Best of luck in your exam and all the best. Take care.